My first memory of creating is of um, creating or setting up like a laboratory situation in my garage that mimicked the kind of like a Super Friends or superheroes lab with all these different consoles and all these different materials, and I would glue just blocks of wood together, scraps of wood, or make drawings, or just kind of have all these different things going on at once, kind of like a mad scientist lab. And I remember rolling out long rolls of like Play-Doh and connecting them from one component to another component. Again, kind of mimicking this mad scientist machinery or lab kind of environment. And so I don't necessarily remember making something in particular, but instead I remember creating an environment first. Yeah. I grew up in Virginia Beach, Virginia, in a beach and surf culture in the suburbs, and so it's also a big Navy town. So there's a lot of transition, people coming and going. But I was there actually from kindergarten through 12th grade. My father was in the Navy before I was born, so that's what took my parents to Virginia Beach, and then they opted to stay there. I think primarily because it had a good, solid public school system. No, my mother always made things, more craftsy kind of objects, and we always had bandsaws and tools in the garage, and we always had supplies around, and all my toys were made by her, as I was growing up, from scraps of wood and from like milk carton tops and containers, butter containers and fruit containers and things like that. So all my toys were always made, and she always continued making things, and so I was always kind of in kind of a materials environment growing up. Sure, yeah. I remember feeling, I mean, I can remember being maybe like 12, 13 years old and being genuinely scared about like a nuclear war. Um, and a lot of the drawings that I was kind of making at that time were these kind of fantastic post-apocalyptic kind of environments and worlds, and half man, half robot, kind of like, dark and doomed visions of the future. So yeah, I mean, I remember, very distinctly kind of Cold War era, and it just seems so bizarre now, looking back, that anyone would kind of grow up fearing nuclear war. I don't know. I can't say that I recognize directly any kind of influence. Not, not that I can see directly. It's probably play a part more subconsciously somehow that I can't immediately recognize. But there was always this feeling not only of kind of impending doom, but just like suppression. Yeah. Yeah, I guess so. And because I didn't really have any kind of control group environment, I didn't really recognize it as overt as it probably really was. Yeah. I can remember dating a girl in high school whose husband, or whose father, I'm sorry, was in the military, and so there were kind of military families that I was kind of aware of whose parents were in the Navy, and so I guess that was kind of my control group. That must be someone coming up. Sorry. Well, like I said, my father was out of the military by the time I had started kindergarten, and I was growing up. And so I didn't really feel the military presence as much as maybe I felt it through my friends, families and parents. So I don't know if it actually influenced me directly. Yeah. Sure, yeah. I think, like I said, Virginia Beach was a surf and skate culture. And so um, those activities were kind of the epitome of cool, skating and surfing. And not only the activities, but all the kind of brands and signs and signifiers that went along with those and were primarily dictated by local surf shops. And not only local surf shops, but kind of like national brands too. So for instance, we would have the local 17th Street surf shop, mini chain, because they opened up many stores, and wave riding vehicles, and Pete Smith surf shop, and but then there are also kind of the bigger brands like Quicksilver, for instance, and Vans. But I remember those logos and labels being cool. No, because I could never afford skateboard, and my family couldn't afford surfboards and couldn't afford these cool clothes. I mean, it was a real treat to get like a long sleeve T-shirt with the surf shop on. I mean, that was a major Christmas gift. So, so the economics kind of played into, you know, not feeling that comfortable with it, and I think as a result, I started making my own things, my own brands and labels and shirts and things like that. No, not necessarily. I was always kind of more academically minded in school, and I was like my class treasurer and president, and played a prominent role in school politics. So I think socially, I didn't really feel necessarily like an outsider, and I always tried to be as inclusive as possible with all the different kind of subgroups, you know, that you find, you know, in high school, all the different kind of cliche cliques or whatever. I think if I ever felt like an outsider, it was because we lived in a kind of a better section in Virginia Beach, because my parents wanted us to move there because of the public school system, but consequently, you know, didn't really necessarily fit in socioeconomically. So. I had a few, kind of a core group of close friends that kind of grew up from like kindergarten through 12th grade. So there were always like a core group of friends around, and our, you know, families were close. And I grew up also playing soccer, and so within the soccer community, the families forged these stronger bonds than you would maybe through other organizations. But I don't know how to answer how were my friends like. I guess like me, I guess. Yeah, I mean, likes like, and that's how, you know, friendships are formed. So like my friends, we would do, you know, similar things. You know, play soccer and skateboard and go to the beach or whatever. Yeah. No, and I always thought I would do go into architecture. I wanted to be an architect when I was in high school. And so I actually, when I was in high school, took a drafting course where you kind of learn technical drawing. And I remember very distinctly, this was a bit of a turning point in deciding that this wasn't for me. The assignment was to show the break between like two different materials, and you do that with, I'm sorry, and you do that with a kind of prescribed visual language or code, you know, broken line. And I thought that my solution was a lot better. Actually showed the material breaking apart, and it was a little, you know, more of an illustrated solution to that. And I was completely wrong, even though I knew my solution was better, and I showed that the materials were breaking apart more so than a jagged line or whatever. So I was like, well, you know, I remember that very distinctly, and thinking, I don't want to pursue something where I know if my solution is better, then it can't prevail. So I decided, well, you know, I still wanted, like, I still felt passionate about communicating visually and making things. And even when I was in bands, I would make the cassette covers and make posters, campaign posters, and make report covers. And so I knew that's what I liked. I didn't know that it was necessarily called graphic design. And then when I did, and this was still in high school, I knew that that's really what I wanted to study. because art was never really an option. The whole art world seemed to exist somewhere else. Um, I would get like Interview magazine, for instance, which was then being run by Andy Warhol, of course, and it was a window to this other kind of art world that just seemed so otherworldly. It just wasn't a possibility. The only kind of art world that I immediately had some connection to was like a boardwalk art show, which was Driftwood and Googly Eyes and Wind Socks and things like that. So I knew, I just didn't think art was an option. And then furthermore, art was always kind of something, in public school, was always something pursued by like the dumb kids, and it was an easy class to take. And I knew that wasn't me. So I was looking for some kind of some kind of a more structured art, or an art with a kind of a more intellectual pursuit. And for me, that kind of meant graphic design. Because when I was in high school, I also first learned about this great magazine called Emigre. And that was independently produced in California, and I come every month. I had a subscription to Emigre before I had my driver's license. And it was an oversized format magazine. It was uncoated paper, and it just opened up my eyes to what graphic design could be, and something a little more expressive than designing whatever else. So what was the point of that? Oh, just to illustrate that. I think it was that magazine kind of opened my eyes to the possibilities of graphic design. That's why I knew I wanted to kind of pursue. Not even realize that art was an option. Yeah, I did. I went to Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. Yeah. And for me, it was the choice between Carnegie Mellon and Rhode Island School of Design. And I got a scholarship to Carnegie Mellon. And Rhode Island School of Design, as great as it is, it's not a university, and I really wanted to go for kind of a broader education where the art and design pursuit was just a component of a larger education. When I was a sophomore, I believe, at Carnegie Mellon, I was showing my paintings in like a barber shop, a haircut, one of the cooler kind of haircut places that showed art. Yeah. And it was in this section of Pittsburgh called Oakland. So I showed some paintings there. I also showed at another kind of alternative art coffee house place called the Beehive, also in Pittsburgh. And I think that was when I think I was showing my work because I wanted to show it, and not necessarily part of like an elementary school exhibition or something like that. I never thought or saw an artist as an inspiration in terms of career, just only in terms of like aesthetics. So there were a lot of like designers whose work was very kind of bold and graphic that I liked. Neville Brody comes to mind, and I loved his work. He did a lot of work for like The Face magazine in London and had a firm there, and I always followed his work and was attracted to how bold and simple and graphic and it was. Again, Emigre continued to be an influence for me through Carnegie Mellon. Artists like Keith Haring and Warhol, while they were inspirations, they still felt kind of alien and otherworldly and coming from and living in another space. Whereas, I could relate more to the work and careers of designers. No, not ever seriously did I skateboard, except for just in high school. And my friends and I would just build half pipes and launch ramps and go to all the contests. And I was never very good at all. And what, aside or in addition to just enjoying the activity, I also enjoyed painting my own decks and cutting up the grip tape and the patterns and images and painting the launch ramps and painting the half pipes. And so I never really realized that was the attraction to skate. It could have been any sport as long as there were canvases involved. And I think skateboarding provided different surfaces. Yeah, I think skateboarding, obviously, it's an activity that you do by yourself, but in the company of others usually, which is a slight difference than like team sports. And I grew up, like I said, playing soccer, and I really stopped playing soccer in like junior high. But obviously, in a team sport, there's a division of labor, and you're responsible for your role within the team. And I think in skateboarding, you define your own role, and like I said, while it's an individual sport, you are still doing it in the company of other people. So I think there's a nice balance there between being part of a community but not being part of a team and still doing your own thing. Well, when I first moved to New York, I was pursuing both design and art in parallel. I never really saw a crossover between the two for me personally. So I would participate in gallery group shows and then do album covers at night or whatever. And so there didn't, didn't really run into anyone who shared my parallel pursuits until I was working at Atlantic Records, and that's where I met Ramon Yang, Rostar, and he and I were both into silk screening and both into designing album covers and both into making paintings and doing all kind of these things at the same time. And so I think, and that must have been 1994, 1995. And I think Ro is kind of the first person that I met with whom I shared kind of a kindred spirit. Yeah. And then from there, obviously you meet more people, and I don't think, I can't remember the first time that we actually like showed together or anything more formally like that. It was just a meeting in the art department at this record label, and then going to each other's kind of self-produced exhibitions. I remember soon after I met him, I went to a show that he put on of his work over on the Bowery in an abandoned loft, and I thought that was very inspirational to me, because my art pursuit, like I said, was kind of separate and parallel, and really through this kind of gallery group show system, and I didn't necessarily feel like I was a part of any kind of like group. It was just kind of these gallery director or gallery dealer driven group shows. It wasn't like a bunch of our friends getting together. So I think Ro was kind of the first person I met, and then seeing him kind of do his own thing was really inspirational. I don't really feel like a significant, I don't feel like I'm a part or a significant part of an artist community or group. But I am friends with a lot of artists and a lot of people whose work I respect. I don't know if the community has really played much of a role significantly in my work. Besides just kind of being in group shows and friendships, but it's not like unlike, for instance, Barnstormers, who are actually collaborating and working together. There's a real sense of community there, and I know those guys, and I've participated on occasion in that. But I've always really just kind of done my own thing. I don't like to collaborate, and I don't really work with other people. I just kind of like doing my own thing. So I think only formally through group shows and only socially through friendships is there, for me, this kind of participation in the community. Now, as far as New York goes, there are a lot of, I think being in New York fosters those kind of communities, the social ones and the group shows, but not really within the work. You know. I don't know if that makes any sense. I'm trying to be clear about the dichotomy between, you know, being a part of a community through the work and collaborating and sharing those kind of aesthetic affinities versus just, you know, being part of a community socially and through group shows. You know. For the most part, I feel like I'm kind of on my own, you know, in my own world, still among other, you know, worlds. It does, not necessarily aesthetically, but career-wise. And I think I'm most inspired by people who are doing their own thing and not waiting to be chosen, and not waiting for permission to make something, and not waiting for opportunities. People who are just forging ahead and making it happen on their own. I'm most inspired by my peers who are doing that. And that doesn't necessarily hold true just for artists. You know, people who have their own businesses and people who are, you know, making their own films or opening their own stores or, you know, creating their own one-man comedy show or something. You know, anything. Just people who are just kind of doing their own thing. That's an inspiration to me, you know, and an influence. You know. Well, I think I do, and I see similarities between the aesthetics of the work, and I think within Beautiful Losers there are subgroups, and I think of those subgroups I'm probably more aligned with, you know, obviously the people who are doing kind of cleaner, harder edge, more graphic style work. So I recognize that definitely, and I think all those subgroups are only going to become more clearly defined, kind of as an outgrowth from this, you know, Beautiful Loser show. So I definitely see aesthetic alignments, but it's not anything that we are discussing, and there's no manifesto at the center of it. But I think there's a lot of mutual respect, and, you know, with, you know, my peers and friends, we are showing each other our work and our work in progress, and we're always excited to do studio visits. And but again, I think those are just I think those are any kind of groupings are kind of having only to do with aesthetics, because a lot of times the subject matter isn't necessarily the same. So I don't know if they're superficial groupings, but they're definitely kind of external, you know. I think within the Beautiful Losers exhibition, there's a range of aesthetics and a range of styles. And so one of the underlying threads may be that, and I do feel this is accurate, people, again, kind of, everyone's doing it on their own, and they're forging their own way. And they're able to do so more and more easily because of the times we live in, and, you know, because of tools like the internet and equalized distribution channels, and it's easier to kind of just make your own work and get it out there and share it. So maybe it's everyone's individual drive that is the same and similar throughout, more so than aesthetics, and maybe even more so than the actual content. No, I don't make political work, or even very kind of a socially conscious kind of work. I'm concerned more with aesthetics and semiotics and visual language and themes, I think, that transcend those kind of localized, you know, political themes. To me, the work is so specific to here and now, political work, for example, that I'm trying to make something a little more timeless. It's not that I'm against that, and also it's just not in me, so I can't fake that, you know. No. I mean, I have very strong feelings, but I'm not actively involved in politics, and I think it's a result of just kind of being turned off and just like, all right, I'm going to create my own set of laws and rules to live by, you know. And I think it's a reaction to what is going on to not want to be involved in any of that stuff. You know, it's just such a turnoff. You know. Well, I think in the sense that it's my own politics as opposed to subscribing to like I'm Democrat, I'm liberal, I'm whatever. So I definitely see political structures and will respond to those in my own work. For instance, there's a lot of like individuality versus corporate structures and that kind of imagery I'll use a lot. But I've never really defined that as in terms of politics. You know, that's just kind of my own observations.
That would be considered social conscience.
Okay, then, yeah. I'm just fearful to like say that there are systems of belief that already exist that I'm trying to share. I just have my own system, my own world. So then I guess so, but I never really thought of it. I never thought of my work as being like political or socially conscious or anything like that. I just kind of thought of it as just a reaction to what's going on. Yeah, that's interesting. I never thought of it because maybe the danger is if you do kind of set out to make a certain kind of work, then it's going to be artificially produced and and this is one of the reasons why feedback from curators is so important because there are people who have informed eyes that can see things that I just can't because I'm so close to it. More recently I've been interested in the kind of signs and signifiers of wealth, and as those relate to heraldry and crests and organic forms. That kind of symbolize status. And maybe this does kind of come from, I'm sure it does, growing up, like I said, in Virginia Beach and recognizing, all right, there are certain forms and logos and brands that mean one thing and symbolize social status. But it's funny because I never really thought of like, all right, I'm making like a socially conscious work, or political work. I guess it is to some degree, but I never really recognize it. Oh yeah, definitely. If you do a commercial job, you're in the service industry, and you want to perform a service, and that is completely different than creating art. Sure, but that's never really the primary goal. If my goal is to kind of share my own ideas, well then there's an industry for that. There are already systems in place, and that I make a painting. Yeah. Oh sure, yeah, and I don't really do a lot of that anymore. But being independent, afforded me the opportunity to turn down a lot of stuff and turn down a lot of work that I wouldn't be able to if I had, big overhead and staff and kind of grew a company, or if I were part of another company. So yeah, of course, yeah, and so I guess that begs the next question: what are some of those lines here? I guess, but more and more so, I've been able to turn down work simply because it doesn't resonate with me. I just don't care about it, and it doesn't really have anything to do with me. I'm more inclined to do something for someone I know and for a purpose I kind of believe in. Friends starting a company and need some help or something like that. I just got a call yesterday about someone who's opening a children's store and doing it from scratch, and it sounds like a worthy pursuit that I certainly wouldn't mind contributing to. So. Yeah, so the sponsorship book came out of an exhibition that I did at Shepard Fairey's gallery in Los Angeles. And about a year and a half before the exhibition, he had invited me to do a show. And I knew that it wasn't necessarily a proper gallery space. It was an extension, really, of his studio, his design studio. And so I didn't really feel comfortable doing kind of like a proper art exhibition. I wanted to do something that kind of played with that art and commerce space. And so I came up with this sponsorship exhibition, which was a reaction to a lot of these exhibitions that needed to have, that have been getting sponsorship. And so you'll get an invitation to just be like a grid of logos at the bottom. And it just seemed getting to be more and more absurd. So I wanted to push that even further and create an exhibition where there was no content, but only sponsorship. And the sponsorship then became the content. And so we got a bunch of different sponsors for the exhibition and put up their logo on the walls in direct proportion to how much they contributed to the show. And each company could contribute just straight up money or products to give away at the opening. And so we would just create piles and pyramids of these products for the exhibition to give away. And we had a lot of drink sponsors, had a lot of drinks piled all over the place. So the idea was that the sponsorship became the content, and it was essentially an empty show. And we also did an exhibition poster, which they do for every exhibition, which was just a grid of logos, and that was it. And then we did the sponsorship book, which was and is a compilation of essays and interviews that I did with a lot of peers and contemporaries about this idea of sponsorship and working with corporations. Had a few people write essays for the book, including Carla McCormick and Shepard Fairey wrote an essay, Steve Powers wrote an essay, Adam Glickman wrote an essay, I think Christian Strike wrote an essay. And I interviewed a bunch of different artists like Rose Starr and Ease, Barry McGee, Evan Hecox, and a dozen others. Yeah. Those are a few examples. Cause, Chris Johansson. I was, in creating the sponsorship book and conducting all the interviews, I was hoping to just get an accurate snapshot of the landscape of where kind of how everyone felt about this issue. I tried to approach everything as objectively as possible and ask all the same questions and cover the same topics, and not necessarily inject my own personal views, but really let everyone's voice come through. And so consequently, what I came up with was a broad range of attitudes about working with corporations, and not necessarily, and working with corporations in a bunch of different ways, like having corporations sponsor art shows, or doing straight up commercial work, or doing kind of these co-branded projects with corporations where artists are creating products, and this whole idea of like limited edition and what it means to make all those different things. So there's a whole range of answers and feelings about all these topics in the book. Yeah, and I don't draw any conclusions at the end. It's just kind of left, kind of open-ended. I could just kind of repeat your astute comment and pretend it's my own. So at the time, I was pretending. Yeah, you're right. And I think in a lot of ways, that's always been my strategy to participate in a system that you want to change. And so you're right, in this sponsorship exhibition and book, one strategy in recognizing that the whole sponsorship thing has been getting out of control could be to turn the other way and ignore it and say, well, fuck you corporations, I'm having nothing to do with it. Or, go 180 degrees in the other direction and I wouldn't use the word celebrate that, but really try to exploit and saturate and see what happens when you do create an exhibition with no content and it's just the logos. And I think that's been kind of a strategy of mine all along in a lot of things I do, even going back to being a part of, you know, high school government, you know, being like the president of my class and despising the people that normally would fill those roles, but then saying, well, you know, the more subversive act would be to, you know, assume that power for myself. And so, you know, once I was kind of in those different school government positions, you know, just like go around and take my friends out of class, and then we would skip school and we had our own parking lot or, you know, parking spots and things like that. And so we would kind of use all the things that, you know, all the power that, you know, came with those positions for our own benefit. No, I don't feel like I'm kind of getting over in any way, because like I said before, when you decide to take on like a commercial project, you really are performing a service, and you want to do that service as best you can. And I think if you haven't really come to terms with the differences in those industries, then you might be more inclined to feel like you've got to get over, you know, in order to make it right. But if you just, you know, understand from the beginning that, you know, a commission project really is part of the service industry, then you want to do a good job, you know, and do a more honest job for someone. And this kind of comes, you know, and you're going to want to do a more honest job if it's a job you want to do in the first place. So I think those are kind of more important decisions to make up front before you decide to take something on that you're going to do for someone else for money. And then on the back end, what you do with that money, I think, is even more important. And if I can use, you know, a commission project and the fee from that to help, you know, fabricate more work and, you know, buy more materials and pay my rent, you know, then I'm certainly comfortable doing that, you know, in addition to wanting to do a good job for someone, because it's something I believe in also. Well, I think my work tends to be attractive to different corporations because I'm using this kind of corporate language, visual language. I'm working with the aesthetics of logos and the aesthetics of brands. So on a very pragmatic level, you know, my drawings and my images are easy to reproduce, easy to scale up and easy to scale down. And then they're also very easy to read, you know, and they're very easy to read quickly. So I think that's the reason. Yeah. It really has to do with the aesthetics of the language I'm using. Well, I think it really just comes down to demographics. There are a lot of corporations who recognize that their target audience likes the work of these artists. So I'm not necessarily convinced it's corporations and the agencies that represent corporations are responding to the work, but they recognize that their audience in turn likes this group's work. I mean, that's purely speculative. The other thought is that there are kind of younger people within these agencies and corporations who actually genuinely like the work of a lot of these artists, and so they feel like they might be doing these artists a service if they want it. You know, I think a great example is this recent Nike use of, you saw this, I'm sure, of the Minor Threat album cover, you know, which it was a Nike flyer or an ad that used in this, or appropriated this image from a Minor Threat album cover, and I think basically swapped out, you know, some of the type and put a swish on the guy's sneakers. Anyway, the point is, I think that's, you know, not necessarily a result of a corporation trying to, you know, co-opt, but I think in that, you know, isolated instance, is probably the result of, you know, younger people in-house being so enthusiastic about, you know, their heroes and that imagery and that artwork, and it just somehow kind of getting out. That's probably what happened, and that's probably the same case for a lot of corporations that work with these artists. It's kind of coming from the younger people internally, I think. I suspect. Yeah. Yeah. So either of those It's two situations, I guess. I think corporate sponsorship of fine art exhibitions isn't necessarily something new. It's kind of been going on since early 20th century. It just hasn't always been so overt. And furthermore, I don't think there's always been such a connection between the corporations and the artists and the artwork. You know, you might have Mobile sponsor, you know, an exhibition at the Met. And there seems to be kind of a disconnect between, you know, where the money's coming from, what's being displayed, and so that, you know, disconnect is getting, you know, smaller and smaller, and there seems to be more of an intimate relationship between the companies that are backing, you know, contemporary art exhibitions now, and who's showing in the work. I'm thinking of like a lot of kind of smaller. Or what you might assume to be are smaller companies and magazines sponsoring the work of people they like, as opposed to just sponsoring an exhibition. You know? And I think you're right. Corporations certainly are kind of the new patrons to some degree. They're replacing, you know, royalty and family and governments, and not only as patrons, but they're replacing them as, you know, religious entities, and, you know, will believe in brands more than will believe in deities. You know, so it's not only happening through art patronage; it's happening in other facets, I think, of life as well. I don't know if it's either the result of corporations having more of a presence, you know, in our lives. That and or combined with the fact that, you know, maybe religion and government don't have as much of a prominent role in our lives anymore. I don't know if either one of those or a combination. But ultimately we want to believe in something, and, you know, maybe these corporations just have better branding than the church does, and better branding than the government does, you know, or different political parties do. And that's why you see, you know, when you know, elections are styled after advertising campaigns more and more, because they're effective. I guess maybe there was a seminal article in Tokion magazine called Disobedience, and that, I think, was one of the first times that you know, an editorial position was taken on kind of what's going on, and one of the early attempts at grouping and labeling. Maybe that's one of the early times. I'm trying to think of something earlier, besides just people putting together their own group shows, and I can think of maybe they all kind of blur together at this point. But that's one of the first external attempts, I think, at trying to figure out what's going on. It did make sense. It did not seem like it was coming. It was contrived. It felt, you know, organic. It was logical. Yeah, and as obvious as you might think it is, I don't think it can be overstated work ethic. And a lot of these artists, my peers and contemporaries, we do work really hard, and that's because we feel very passionate about what we do, and it's not, you know, something we have to force ourselves. You know, have to force ourselves to work hard. But I think that's worth mentioning. There's this drive that's coming from somewhere. But I think that's an important ingredient. Other ingredients include the kind of assuming of different kind of distribution powers and manufacturing abilities. Like, we're making our own things, whether they be T-shirts and skateboards, or paintings and exhibitions and installations. we're not waiting for permission, and we're not waiting for opportunities, and we're just making it because we can't not make these things, you know. But of course, you know, making these things isn't enough. I think, you know, using the same kind of tools that corporations use is also another ingredient. Distribution tools and networking tools, and so I think those three ingredients contribute to any kind of like popularity or success. You know, I don't, you know, that's all kind of beyond the work itself and people responding to it, which is more subjective, and those aren't things I can necessarily quantify. I think what a lot of younger people are responding to when it comes to these exhibitions and openings is this isn't the right word. I was going to say permission kind of granted, or they're inspired by people who are just kind of making their own work. Like I mentioned before, growing up in Virginia Beach, my only sense of art and art shows were like boardwalk art shows. And the art world that I saw in Interview magazine, for instance, was just otherworldly. It wasn't tangible. And so that's why I never thought it was a real opportunity for me. So I think I can only assume that when younger people are coming to these exhibitions and openings, they're getting a feeling of there's a real opportunity to do what I like, do what I want, and live life the way I want to live it, not have to go down a prescribed career path or whatever, you know. I think that's the spirit that's being shared, you know. That and the fact that a lot of, you know, these artists are making work that is accessible. Then you can actually walk away from an exhibition with a piece of it, or with something that you actually like in the form of a t-shirt or a book or a skateboard, or, you know, obviously something that's a little, you know, that's affordable. And that usually isn't the case, or hasn't traditionally been the case with museum exhibitions, you know. And I've never really thought of my work and content as socially conscious work, because you know, to me that's such a kind of a loaded phrase. Those words are really loaded, and represent something that I don't really feel about. But I guess just by kind of observing the world and responding to it almost is by default, you know, in some strange way. I never really thought of the labeling it like that, though. But I guess it is, yeah. I think there are a lot of kind of mini narratives that kind of go on in the work, and those just kind of come out of daily experiences and memories, and I've never really approached that content very consciously. It's just making drawings or whatever. Yeah. Well, I think what's going to happen is that now that there is kind of a coarser, larger group that's been somewhat defined, however tight or loose it may be, there'll definitely be subgroups that emerge out of it, where I think, you know, people start to recognize tighter threads among the subgroups. For instance, just aesthetically, we talked about how there's a whole range within the Beautiful Losers group. You can kind of pull out, you know, different subgroups along that aesthetic range from, you know, this kind of work that I make, which is a little tighter and harder edged, to looser, kind of more primitive work, to even just format and medium, you know, photography and film or whatever. So I think that, you know, it's only going to become a little more fragmented. That doesn't, that doesn't really answer your question about how the work is evolving and the artists are evolving. And that I can't, really answer. I simply don't know. I can only hope that everyone kind of maintains this spirit of kind of youth and sharing. And I know for me personally, I'll always want to make things that haven't traditionally been defined as like art objects. While I still do paintings and installations, I still want to continue to make books and T-shirts and skateboards and bags and things like that. And I think I'll know I've done something wrong or made a wrong turn if I ever stop making that kind of stuff, or reel it in and try to commodify it through holding on. I think one art career strategy is to not make work or not make a lot of work and really hold on to and elevate prices and play with the market in that way. And I think that's something that a lot of artists in this group aren't interested in at all. Kind of like fabricating value. So I think if I ever start to do that, I'll know I've made a wrong turn. So I hope for myself I continue to make work on a broad range. And I can only speak for myself. The lessons I feel like I've learned in my career so far are so cliche and trite, I'm almost embarrassed to share them, but they're the same things that I'm sure a lot of people have learned with experience, like stay true to yourself, stay true to your own message. I'm learning more and more to maintain control of my work. I've been involved in bad licensing deals, for instance, where people are starting to make work without my permission. And I think consequently you have to, if you want to maintain that kind of control, you kind of have to come off as a bit of a jerk sometimes. But it's all, in the interest of maintaining quality level of work. That's one of the lessons, maintaining control of your own work. And that doesn't necessarily mean withholding the work, but just being in control of the quality, and those lessons, like I said, have come out of licensing deals that have gone bad. Other lessons, I'm relying more and more on intuition and just the way I feel about people before I partner with someone or work with someone on something, and that goes for like dealers or goes for book deals or anything. I'm just relying more on gut instinct, and it's proving to be more and more accurate. So I've never been really one to go on instinct alone. I tend to think about things a little more logically. So that's a lesson, to trust myself more and more, trust my feelings about a situation more and more. Another lesson, learning more and more, and I've learned to invest in my own work. Whatever money I can make, I'm not putting in savings. I don't have a retirement account. I'm not buying mutual funds. I'm investing in myself, and that has come out of trusting myself. I really believe in what I'm doing. And so I'm putting my money where my mouth is, So that's another lesson. Invest in yourself is something I'm learning more and more to do. Another lesson. Every now and then I'll give lectures and go to schools and give talks, and I'm often asked, like, how do you become an artist? And I don't think you choose to. You can, you either are or you aren't. And the moment that you actually decide artists, it's all over. It's almost a default way, or recognizing kind of who you are. Like, I can't not make work, so how do I lead a life that accommodates that? I'm sorry. You can come through.
I just want to listen to you.
Oh.
I know.
In your gym outfit?
No.
Okay, so the question was, what are some of the, so younger people in school ask, well, how do you be an artist? Well, you don't. You just recognize that you are, I think, and then you shape your life around accommodating that drive to make things. I think the moment that you decide or try to be an artist and you're not making art, and that was actually a real turning point for me in my own life and in my own work. Because as I described before, I was pursuing kind of design and art in parallel, and I was making or trying to make this thing called art. Like I would try to make paintings, you know, which is the wrong way to go about it. And it was only when I started to make things that I wanted to make, regardless of how I saw them, or I didn't think I was making art, just making something. Then you're making more honest work. So that was a turning point for me, and that's the kind of advice I would give to someone, not to see molds and forms and careers and fill it, but to recognize who you are and then have, you know what I mean? It's the difference between kind of content and form. You know, I think a lot of people make the mistake of wanting to be a doctor when they don't really care about healing, or want to be a lawyer when they don't really care about truth and justice. So the advice I try to give people is to not fill vessels and fill these kind of prescribed forms, but just recognize who you are, and then kind of make your own way. You know, because people are going to attach labels anyway, and so that's some of the advice I give, or try to give. Yeah. I can't say something without sounding just embarrassingly cliche, which is, you know, just.
Everybody feels that way.
But you know what? The be yourself message is something that I kind of always heard growing up, and you hear it through different cultural outlets, be it, you know, songs or TV shows or whatever, and it never resonated as something that was true, and I felt it become more and more true throughout my life. It was always an empty message, or when it's sung in a jingly way, or when it's presented, you know, in slick packaging. I think the real meaning of it is lost. But I wish I could think of more accurate words that would ring more true than just be yourself. But I think that's, for now, all we're kind of stuck with, you know, which is too bad, because it sounds really corny, but it's true, you know. Yeah. Or to elaborate a bit more, to, like I was saying before, recognize kind of who you are, and recognize your strengths, and recognize where you come from. And this relates again, and, you know, just blubbering going on, you know. I'm trying to make it tighter, so hopefully through editing, the magic of editing, you can make this appear a little tighter. But you know, the message obviously is kind of be yourself and recognize who you are, and what your strengths are and where you come from, and embrace that. And I think key turning points for me have always been along those lines. You know, being comfortable with what I'm good at, which is kind of this kind of drawing. You know, being comfortable with where I am, or where I'm coming from. Where I've always tried to escape that. You know, first thing I did when I graduated high school was escape Virginia Beach, and went to a relatively more metropolitan area, Pittsburgh, and then went straight to New York. You know, but you know, I'm from Virginia Beach. You know, and I always will be.